Hello, welcome to The Secret Mind. In a previous life, or what feels like it, I committed to reading an audiobook. This is it. Oh, I've already got it up. This is it. Ta-da! We are halfway through, and this is the longest chapter. I'm going to split it into two pieces. Oh boy. Hey, it's hotting up. You've got to admit it. And we've got better sound, and I'm going to put the text back on the screen, which is something where I started. This is Every Man an Enemy by W. Howard Baker. Chapter 10. 8 pairs of hands rested around a roasting fire. Outside, it was cold and beginning to snow, and the wind was whistling around the gables. But here, in the broad lounge of John Bovis's house on the river near Marlow, it was cosily warm. A great Yule log blazed in the open hearth. In the background, merry music played softly. A punch bowl passed. Sparks danced their way up the chimney, chestnuts sizzled and popped on the very edges of the fire in the hot grey ash. The 8 pairs of hands stretched themselves. It was good to be here on Christmas Eve. They were hands of all sizes and shapes. There were fat hands and thin hands, long hands and square hands, and there were the hands of a murderer among them. Which were they? And whose hands were they? Which hands had poured an overdose of paramin into the hot chocolate the man with the 7 o'clock face had enjoyed as an invariable nightcap? Whose hands had gently but firmly assisted Lavinia Webb from this life by pushing her out of a speeding train? More drinks were brought in, and the hands were busy again. Blake's hands, Prout's hands, Tinker's hands, Carla's hands, and those belonging to Bovis, Harvey Innes and Mackintosh, and Herbert Asprey's hands too, which were the murderous ones. Only they and their owner knew. Blake was telling ghost stories, pleasant little blood curlers that he related rather well. Everyone in the room was relaxed and in a mellow mood, even the murderer. For the murderer, things were moving along very nicely. There had been 2 deaths, and no trouble. The murderer could relax, and why not? The right to relax had been earned. Later, no doubt, there would be more work to do. But in the meantime. As for the other people in the room, they could see no reason why they shouldn't enjoy themselves. They didn't know that Lavinia Webb had been murdered, and the death of the man with the 7 o'clock face was remote from them now. It had ceased to touch them. So, old sins were forgiven, old animosities were allowed to die. Only 2 people in the room appreciated that there was a killer there that night. And since one of them was the killer, and the other was Blake, and neither was disposed to speak of what they knew, a merry atmosphere prevailed. Hardly anyone spared a thought for Fawcett or his agonizing death. Hardly anyone troubled to look twice at the punch before drinking it. And if anyone thought of Lavinia Webb, they thought of her kindly, and with no hint of alarm. It could be thought, comfortably, that she would be along presently. Only the murderer knew that she would never experience an earthly Christmas Eve around a blazing fire ever again. Milly purred throatily, each purr ending in the slightest, tiniest hiccup. Milly was enjoying herself. By moving her head only very slightly, she could reach Herbert's glass when he wasn't looking. This was good punch. It was fine stuff. Milly was glad she had allowed Herbert to bring her. She was very glad indeed that they had come. Just before 11, the doorbell rang. Footsteps went to answer it across the hall. Blake, telling his 6th ghost story of the evening, hesitated for an instant. The same thought was in his mind as in the minds of the others. Was this Lavinia Webb? "I'll go and see," John Bovis said, getting up from his seat in front of the blazing fire. "You carry on, Blake. You're doing famously." But Blake didn't carry on. As Bovis left the room, the sound of a voice speaking to the manservant in the hall came to the detective through the partly open door. It was a man's voice, soft but penetrating, and there was something about it. It stopped Blake in mid-sentence. He frowned. He shot a swift glance at Tinker. Blake thought that he knew the voice, but he couldn't immediately identify it. Where had he heard it before? Tinker was frowning too. Blake rose to his feet, and then Bovis and the visitor appeared through the doorway. The man with their host was elderly, of medium height and somewhat frail looking. He was well dressed, and his obvious good taste and the quality of the clothes that he wore labelled him as someone of substance. A Dr. Carlton, Bovis was saying. He lost his way, and I saw your lights through the trees at the end of the drive and came along to get my bearings. I hope you don't mind. The old gentleman sounded very good-humoured. Blake eyed him closely, but unobtrusively. He knew that voice. He couldn't recall ever having met Dr. Carlton before, yet, oddly enough, there was something vaguely familiar about his face, too. Now that you're here, you'll have a drink, of course, Bovis said. Carla, can you pour something for Dr. Carlton? Well, sir, what will it be? A large whisky, sir, if you really mean it, and can give me a peppermint afterwards. Don't forget that I'm driving. But I don't want to intrude. And then the old doctor stopped. He'd just noticed Blake and Tinker. His expression underwent a sudden change. The seasonal benevolence, which he'd been exuding with the generosity of a latter-day Mr. Pickwick, departed from his face. For a fraction of a second, his features were completely blank, and then they settled into a wariness which told Blake that he'd been recognised by the doctor, and that the man's memories of him were not at all pleasant. Seeing the hiatus developing and following the old man's gaze, Bovis could only say the first thing which came into his head. You two know one another? You've met? I don't think so, old Dr. Carlton said carefully. Though I must say, he added directly to Blake, you're very like someone that I used to know, and he sighed, the poor fellow. Oh, Bovis said, oh, what happened to him? Fellow couldn't mind his own business, the old gentleman said. He looked at Blake pointedly. This was in the Middle East at the end of the last war. You know what a mess things were in there. You remember Arab and Jewish terrorist organisations killing each other and our boys in the middle of it all. I remember, said Blake. And this friend of yours, not a friend, sir, just a fellow I knew. He was out there in the army. Parcel arrived at the mess one morning and it wasn't even for him. But as I said, this fellow couldn't mind his own business. It was what you might call a failing of his. He was a fine chap in every other way you could name. And, Blake prompted quietly. Well, said the doctor, the fellow thought he heard this parcel ticking. Thought it was a bomb. Grabbed it up and it was ticking. It was just a small parcel. Hadn't come through the post, been delivered by hand. Fella couldn't leave well alone. Sprinted out of the mess holding it. Going to put it in a pail of water. Then the ticking stopped. He hurled it from him. The old man shook his head sadly. Poor chap. Why, what happened? Said Bovis. There was an Arab, the doctor said, standing directly in the path of the parcel. He thought it was a bomb too. They hanged him. Who? The Arab? Said Carla. But why? Thought this fellow I knew was throwing a bomb at him, said the doctor. Pulled out a gun from beneath his jalaba and shot him stone dead, all for nothing. It wasn't a bomb then. This from Harvey Innes. He'd been following the story very intently. Dr. Carlton smiled mirthlessly. Not at all. He just said it was an alarm clock someone in the mess had sent out for repair, and as I said, it wasn't even addressed to this fellow I knew, but he couldn't leave well enough alone. He couldn't mind his own business. Sexton Blake nodded slowly. A truly cautionary tale, he said thoughtfully, and very well told, Doctor, into the bargain. It behooves us all to take care. There he paused. Then he said, You know, Doctor, I have the oddest feeling that I should know you. I'm most annoyed with myself. I'm sure you are, the old gentleman answered with pointed venom. Bovis laughed, almost nervously. There was an atmosphere between these two. You could feel it. There was hostility here. He didn't understand it at all. He took heart. He took refuge in heartiness. Whatever it was, this was the time of year to bury the hatchet, and he said as much before burying his nose in his glass. Good luck, he bumbled through the amber liquid. But why, oh why, Jimmy Mackintosh wondered, watching the scene narrowly, did he have the feeling that the good Dr. Carlton wished he could do his hatchet burying in Sexton Blake's head? The old gentleman had had his large whisky. Now he would go. Nothing that anyone could say would stop him. If you'll just tell me how to reach Henley from here, I don't know this part of the world at all. It's not far, John Bovis said. I could draw you a map. Would you? Carlton reached into an inner pocket and drew out his wallet. He produced an old envelope. Use the back of this. Before the old man thrust his wallet back, negligently into a side pocket of his heavy ulster, Jimmy Mackintosh had seen that it was stuffed with money. Interesting. One end of the wallet still poked out of the pocket. Even more interesting, this. Mackintosh made himself heard. I can put you on the Henley Road. You can? The doctor was surprised at the interruption. Then he said, but I couldn't dream of dragging you away from your friends. Mackintosh smiled easily and shrugged. Think nothing of it. It's hot in here. I'd welcome a breath of fresh air. Besides, the Henley Road is not that far away. It would mean walking back, the doctor said doubtfully. It isn't far, Mackintosh insisted, but for all that, you could miss the turning, particularly as it's been snowing. I'll be glad to show you. Well, Carlton hesitated with the used envelope in his hand. That would be uncommonly good of you, if you really wouldn't mind. I'll get my coat, Mackintosh said. It was only the sight of the money which had made him offer his services. Anyone who treated so much money so negligently deserved to be relieved of it. Jimmy Mackintosh wanted the wallet. He needed the money inside it. He would talk to the old doctor first and take his wallet in parting from him. It would be easy. Mackintosh wrapped up warmly. He rejoined Carlton. He watched the old man shake Blake's hand and Tinker's and murmur Merry Christmas. He noted that the doctor didn't really mean what he said. His handshake was loose and most unwilling. He seemed almost afraid that once Tinker and Blake came to grips with him, he would not get his hand back. They walked down to the gate, through the swirling snowflakes, and Mackintosh restrained his itching fingers with difficulty. He knew exactly where the wallet was. He only had to go reach for it. Carlton would not feel it go. They arrived at the old man's car, and to take his mind off the wallet and all it contained, Mackintosh began to talk and talk and talk. Dr. Carlton joined the conversation between reversing his car and turning it round, whenever he could get one word in edgeways. It was a relief to Mackintosh after that to let his fingers do their nimble work, to set Carlton on the Henley Road, and to take payment for his services at the same time. He watched the tail lights of the old man's car dwindle and vanish. He called out, Merry Christmas, bubbling with laughter. Then he counted his haul. It was as he supposed. The wallet contained a thick wad of new tenors. There was more than £400 there. Jimmy Mackintosh began to whistle to himself. No ordinary sneak thief, he. He walked back to Bovis's house. As he had told the doctor, it wasn't far from the Henley Road. He covered the ground in minutes. Now, what to do with the wallet? And with the money? Sooner or later, Carlton was going to learn of his loss. When he did, what was he going to do about it? Was he going to come back here in hope of finding his wallet again? How was he going to imagine he'd lost it? Would he think he'd dropped it on the way down the drive to the car? Jimmy Mackintosh didn't know what Dr. Carlton would think, but he had enough sense to realise that he couldn't take too many precautions. The house might be searched for the wallet, for instance. £400 was one hell of a lot of money to lose. With that much at stake, a thoroughgoing search of the house was more than likely. The doctor wouldn't know what had happened to it. He would think that he might have dropped it anywhere in the house or along the drive, and at some stage he was going to report his loss to the police. It wouldn't do, then, Jimmy Mackintosh thought, for him to secrete the wallet and the money that it contained amongst his own possessions. With the police certain to be brought into this business sooner or later, he could not be too careful. He would have to hide his loot somewhere, preferably somewhere in the grounds of the house until the holiday had ended and it was safe to retrieve it. He would have to hide it somewhere, and he knew just the place. When Bovis had brought his guests from the station in the car, he had driven them round to the back of the house. He'd stopped the car in front of the garage, and near the garage there was a well, an old well, dried up and disused now, Bovis had said. The garage had once been a coach house and stables, and it had been necessary to have a supply of water on hand, but now plumbing and all the other main services had rendered the old well obsolete. It was never used now for its original purpose. It gave no water, but Mackintosh had thought of a use for it, and so it was towards the well that he now carefully made his way. There were a number of loose stones just inside the mouth of the well. He could prise them out. The wallet could, and would, rest safely behind them when they were replaced. Jimmy Mackintosh came to the well, and the night was quiet all around him. It had stopped snowing, and, above him, the stars were now burning brightly in a cold and dark sky. The Nativity star burned more brightly than the rest. Far off, away beyond the bend of the river below Marlow, a dog fox barked abruptly. Mackintosh leaned forward. He found the loose stones inside the well mouth and prized them out. He balanced them carefully on top of the low wall which encircled the well, while he thrust Dr. Carlton's bulging wallet into the cavity which he had created. It fitted beautifully. He was very pleased with himself. He put the loose stones back in position and pushed them home. In doing so, he dislodged a few small pieces of mortar, and these fell down the deep, dark shaft to strike the bottom of the well with small, echoing, brittle sounds. After the passage of many seconds, the well was deep, and that dry. But how deep? Jimmy Mackintosh was interested. Vaguely, he remembered dropping stones into wells in childhood. Wasn't it possible to estimate a well's depth from the time it took a stone to fall from the top to the bottom? How fast did a stone travel? 10 feet a second? Wasn't that what he remembered? He thought about it briefly. Surely the laws of acceleration came into the calculation somewhere. Didn't a falling body accelerate until a certain maximum velocity was reached? And wasn't this velocity very much greater than 10 feet a second? Jimmy Mackintosh wasn't sure. He wasn't technically minded. Ask him how many gins it should take to thaw a cold blonde, and he'd be able to tell you, with accuracy. Ask him your chances of getting away with a fiddle involving mess funds, and he would be able to answer with feeling. But how did you estimate the depth of a well? He must have voiced the question aloud, for it was instantly answered from behind him. Startling him, someone said, "Easy." Mackintosh tried to straighten up, to wheel round, but he was far too slow. Hands fastened on his ankles and jerked upwards. "You must throw something into the well," the voice said, "and then count." Mackintosh was falling. He was plummeting down through pitch darkness with a soundless scream tearing his lips. He was falling head first into the well, and the voice was bouncing off the walls all around him. "Count! Count! Count!" And that was when Jimmy Mackintosh hit the bottom. He hit it head on. His skull cracked like an eggshell. He died instantly. Far above his broken body, someone straightened up and remarked conversationally, "And that one's 100 feet deep." On the stairs, on the way to his room, Blake suddenly stopped in mid-stride. He gripped Tinker's arm. "Dr. Carlton, my foot," he said explosively. "That was Leon Kestrel." Tinker was startled. "The master mummer? That voice," Sexton Blake said. "Didn't it just sound a little familiar? Of course he did something about it as soon as he spotted us, but think about it, yes?" Tinker said hesitantly. "Try to remember the sound of that voice out in the hall," Sexton Blake urged. "I saw your ears flapping. Well, think, a man can disguise almost everything else without a great deal of effort. And the man we're talking about is so good at disguise that he'd deceive his own mother. But think of the sound of that voice before he had us spotted." Tinker was frowning ferociously. "Radically changing the sound of your voice is something you don't even attempt unless you have to," Blake said. "It's not easy, not even for someone of the caliber of our friend, the mummer. It's something you have to work consciously at. Try to remember." "Good Lord!" Tinker's eyes widened abruptly. Yes, Chief, you're right. Yes, it was Kestrel. Then he grinned ruefully. It makes me feel old. It's been a long time. And it was true. The last time they had seen Leon Kestrel had been many years ago. The place, the Old Bailey. And the sentence passed by the judge had been savage. It had been a talking point for a week afterwards. That savage sentence. 20 years for a first offence. True, Kestrel had been found guilty of fraud on a colossal, a grandiose scale. He'd taken his dupes for a cool $500,000, hard-headed businessmen all, if you could believe it. But still, 20 years for a first offence? And the meek and mild-mannered man in the dock, so nervous, so halting, so unimpressive, frankly hadn't seemed capable of half of the bold and ingenious crimes imputed against him. The judge had known better, however. He had known that this was far from being Leon Kestrel's first and only offence. It was simply the first and only offence for which, thanks to Blake, he could be charged. And the judge had known more. He'd known what Tinker and Blake and the men of New Scotland Yard had long had good reason to know. Leon Kestrel was at liberty. At liberty was neither meek-mannered nor mild, neither nervous nor halting. He had given the mummer the maximum possible sentence. Leon Kestrel at liberty was a very dangerous man. He was an unusual criminal, the 1 in 10,000 who is gifted, imaginative and resourceful. He was the 1 in 25,000 with courage. He had had a truly incredible career as a lawbreaker until, by sheer dogged persistence, Blake had finally brought him to book. He was now in his mid-50s, and the face which Tinker and Blake that evening had seen lined, hollow-cheeked, and bearing every evidence of advancing age, was normally smooth-skinned and fresh, almost boyish. It was as remarkable a face as Leon Kestrel was a man. In repose, his face was absolutely expressionless. It was one of those very few faces which might be legitimately described as a blank. It was a face which made no impression whatsoever upon the beholder, a face which was never really seen, and which was consequently hard to describe and terribly easy to forget. All of these things were true of Kestrel's face in repose. Then, suddenly, acting in obedience to the will of its owner, it would crease and wrinkle in animation, and even without the aid of pigments and powder and plastic skin, Kestrel could make it the face of a kindly old gentleman. The face of a vacuous fool, or that of a fiend intent upon murder. Kestrel had once been an actor, and assisted by the pencils and pigments of his one-time trade, he could achieve miracles. What Blake had said was quite true. The man was so good at disguise that he'd deceive his own mother. He could literally use himself as a blank canvas upon which the quirks and characteristics and physical appearance of others was readily drawn. It was this ability to change his entire appearance at will which made the theatre critics of a previous generation predict a great future for the young Kestrel and declare that in time he could become the finest character player of any age. But he had been unwilling to wait upon fame and upon the fortune that fame would bring him. He had wanted riches yesterday, and today, not tomorrow, and so, after 3 brief seasons on the London stage, he'd slipped out of the limelight and into a life of crime. Here he was, certain his talents would bring a more immediate reward, and he was right. For years he contrived to make a very good living from crime and to keep out of the clutches of the police. Until Blake finally caught up with him, he could point with pride to the fact that he'd never once been fingerprinted, never been photographed, and never seen the inside of a cell. Kestrel, Tinker said, turning up like a bad penny. He's been out some months, Blake said briefly, with full remission. And up to his old games again, obviously, else why the act? Do you think he'd really lost his way, Chief? Blake frowned. I don't know. He didn't know we were here, that's for certain, but beyond that I don't know at all. You think he might be involved in this MacDonald Hall thing? Could be, Blake said slowly. But how? And he sighed. I'd give a lot to know what his game is. They were soon to find out. John Bovis's arms were hard around Carla. Slowly in the darkened lounge the fire was dying. Bovis and Carla were the only ones not yet abed in the house. All of the others had gone upstairs long ago. All, that is, except Jimmy McIntosh, who, Bovis thought vaguely, was still outside somewhere. He dismissed McIntosh from his mind. He'd better things to think about. If the man wanted to stay out all night, that was his affair. If he didn't want to stay out all night, he'd ring the bell and one of the servants would let him in. Bovis turned his head slightly, and Carla's soft red lips were waiting. He kissed her. Happy? Of course, darling. You? Yes, of course. Then she said, Love me? You know that I do. He kissed her again. She pushed him away. Go on, say it. I love you, he said, and he meant it. I love you, Carla. Then he felt her suddenly shiver. What's wrong, darling? Are you cold? Yes, she said quickly. Yes. But she lied. It was not that which had made her shiver. It was something else. She had a secret. Pray God she could keep it. It would destroy her happiness utterly, she was sure, if John Bovis knew. See you tomorrow.